Financial systems don't collapse when people panic. They collapse when the rules change, and no one admits it. Japan didn't fail in the 1990s. Banks stayed open, markets functioned, jobs were protected. But the rules stopped working the way they were supposed to. Losses were delayed instead of absorbed. Failure was postponed instead of resolved. Risk was no longer cleared. It was hidden. Nothing broke. But trust began to erode. Because when rules are rewritten mid-game, people don't lose confidence all at once. They stop believing the system is honest. And once that happens, stability becomes temporary. Trust in financial systems is not built on optimism. It's built on procedure, clear rules, consistent enforcement, predictable consequences. People don't need markets to be fair. They need to know how failure is handled. Japan's mistake in the 1990s was not economic. It was procedural. When the bubble burst, Japan had a choice. Allow losses to be recognized, or delay them to preserve stability. They chose delay. Bad loans were not written off. They were extended. Banks were protected. Unproductive firms were kept alive. Risk was not removed. It was deferred. On the surface, this worked. There was no panic, no collapse, no visible crisis. But the rules had changed. Failure no longer cleared the system. Survival no longer signaled strength. And outcomes no longer followed precedent. That is when trust begins to weaken. Not because people panic, but because the system stops behaving consistently. And once a system changes its own rules to survive, every future decision becomes discretionary. When Japan's bubble burst, the country faced one ugly problem. Banks had made loans backed by land prices that were no longer real. If those losses were admitted fast, banks would fail. And if banks failed, everything else would freeze. So Japan protected the center first, not households, not small businesses. The banks. Instead of forcing weak borrowers to go bankrupt, banks rolled their loans forward. Same borrower, same bad balance sheet. New loan anyway. This was called evergreening. It kept companies alive on paper and kept banks from admitting losses. But it created a new rule. Failure no longer ended things. It just got extended. Once that rule took hold, the system started choosing winners. Large companies tied into banking networks had access to credit. They had relationships. They had protection. Small firms didn't. If you ran a small business, credit tightened. Costs stayed high. Demand fell. And there was nowhere to roll your debt. The economy split in two. Protected inside, starved outside. The labor market reflected this too. Large firms reduced hiring instead of firing. That sounds gentle, until you realize what it does. It protects insiders and sacrifices the next generation. Graduates entered a market with fewer openings, more temporary jobs, and less security. This is where trust changes shape. Not as anger, as adjustment. People learn that connections matter more than performance, that survival matters more than growth, that the system protects the center first. And once enough people learn that, they stop believing the game rewards effort. Trust doesn't collapse, it withdraws. The moment trust really breaks is not when people complain. It's when they change their behavior. In Japan, this didn't appear in headlines. It appeared in everyday decisions. Young workers stopped chasing careers. They took temporary jobs instead. Wages flattened, promotions slowed. The belief that effort would lead somewhere quietly disappeared. People adapted. They delayed marriage. They delayed children. They avoided debt, not because it was expensive, but because the future felt uncertain. Housing told the same story. Property prices kept falling year after year. Buying a home no longer felt like progress. It felt like risk with no upside. So people waited. When millions of people wait at the same time, demand doesn't collapse. It fades. Businesses felt this first. Stores stayed open, but foot traffic thinned. Factories ran, but stopped expanding. The economy still functioned, but it stopped moving forward. This is how trust disappears. Not through panic, through restraint. People stop borrowing, they stop investing, they stop planning far ahead. They don't revolt against the system, they withdraw from it. And once enough people do that, the damage reinforces itself. Lower spending justifies lower wages. Lower wages justify fewer jobs. Fewer jobs justify more caution. Nothing breaks, but nothing recovers. Japan didn't lose trust in one moment. They lost it decision by decision. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they locked the system in place. And once that pattern sets in, no policy announcement can reverse it. Because trust, once replaced by caution, doesn't respond to stimulus. It responds only to credibility. And credibility takes time to rebuild. Japan's story matters because it shows what happens after collapse is avoided. Most systems don't fail all at once. They adapt. And adaptation always has a cost. When debt grows large, when losses are delayed, when institutions are protected to preserve order, the same choice appears again and again. Preserve stability now or allow disruption and reset. Japan chose stability, So did other economies later. Each time, collapse was avoided. Each time, debt was rolled forward. Each time, rules were bent to keep the system intact. And each time, the cost shifted quietly, from balance sheets to time to opportunity to the next generation. The danger isn't sudden collapse. It's slow transformation. Systems where effort no longer guarantees progress, where safety no longer creates confidence, where caution replaces belief. That's when trust doesn't vanish. It withdraws. And once trust withdraws, growth becomes optional. Innovation becomes rare, and the future shrinks without anyone noticing. Japan wasn't a failure. It was a preview. The most important moments in economic history aren't the crashes. They're the decisions made to prevent them. Because once a system chooses stability over renewal, the outcome isn't collapse, it's permanence. In the next episode, we go one step further, to the moment when people stop trusting not just outcomes, but the system itself. Because when trust finally breaks, even stability can't save what comes next.